Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, we're going to create this landing page using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you want to jump to certain spots in the video, be sure to check out the timestamps in the description below. You'll also find a link to a demo, as well as a link to the course files where you can download the final project, as well as the images and the fonts and everything you need to follow along. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started writing the code. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and create a folder that's going to hold our project. So I'm going to head into my desktop here and just go ahead and create a new folder. I'm going to name this folder something descriptive. Now we're going to be using VS Code as my code editor in this tutorial, just because it's one, I think it's super powerful, it's free, and it has a lot of extensions and things like that that are really helpful when doing web development. So with that said, I have that in here on my my dashboard down here, and what I can do is I can take this folder and just drag it over the Visual Studio Code icon, and it's going to open it up in Visual Studio Code. So let's just go ahead and maximize this screen. Go ahead and exit out this welcome, and over here is where we can actually add the files and folders for our project. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder, and we'll call this fonts. Create another one, call this one images, and I'm going to create an index.html file, a styles.css file, and last, a functions.js file. And the first thing I'm going to do is I want to go ahead and head into Figma, which is where I have my images. I want to export those as JPEG, and then I'm going to bring them into this folder. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and head into Figma, where I've already added the design for the project. You can also see the images here. Now I just pulled these from Google. I download them, drop them into Figma, and then I resize them to all be a max width of 1200. And I essentially did the same thing for the profile images. I just found these square profile images on Google, downloaded them, and then resized them to be 400 pixels. So once I have these images ready, I'm just going to go ahead and copy them here, come over to export, and then export these 8 layers. And let's go ahead and save it to the project that we just created in the images folder. So once I save that, if you come back into our project, we should see those images in our folder, which we do. Now, we could go ahead and just say this is done, but I actually like to go ahead and optimize these images using a tool called Image Opt-in, which I'll provide a link in the description for you to check that out. So what you want to do is you want to select these, make sure you have Image Opt-in installed. I'm going to right click, open with, and then come down and select Image Opt-in. And this is going to drop those images in Image Opt-in, and you can see that it's going to optimize these here, where you can see the savings that it saved us as far as the file size, which is just going to mean that it's going to load faster. So let's go ahead and save that now, close out of that. And now that our fonts are done, or excuse me, our images are done, let's go ahead and move one of the fonts that we're going to be using in this project. Now, one of them is going to be a Google font, but another one's not a Google font, so we have to use font face and CSS in order to import that into our project so we can use it. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to pull in the font file that we're going to be using here, and I'm going to include that in the course file, so that's where you can find that font file. Now, I actually have it in the original project that I designed, so I'm going to head there first, take this font file, and just go ahead and drop it here. All right, so I think that's everything we need as far as importing into this these files here. And so let's go ahead and close this. And the next thing we want to do is head into our index.html file. Now, if you're using VS Code, a tool called Emmet comes pre-installed. And this is a really useful tool because it gives you a lot of different shortcuts in writing code. And one of those is HTML boilerplate. So if you do an exclamation point and then do tab, you have this boilerplate HTML already added for us. So the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and just change the title here. So we can just call this something like this. And the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and import our styles sheet that we created over here. And the way we do that is by using a link tag and just importing it. So right under here under the meta, we'll create a link tag. And the href for this will be styles.css. All right. So the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and import the Google font that we're going to be using for this in this project. So what we need to do is head to a browser, then head to fonts.google.com. And what we're going to be using is Open Sans. So let's go ahead and search for that. Add it to our selection here, and then expand this and click on Customize. Now the fonts we need are the regular 400 weight as well as the 700. So once we click that, come over to Embed, and under here under the standard, just go ahead and copy this link tag. We don't need this anymore, so let's go ahead and close out. And under the CSS, we can just go ahead and import the fonts here. And that's everything we need to do as far as in the head of our project. The next thing we want to do is head into the body and start adding the HTML elements that we need for our page structure. Now the first thing I want to do is at the top, I'm going to create a button. So I'm using Emmet, I'm just going to type out button. And then in here, I'm actually not going to have anything. It's just going to be no text here. And it's going to have an ID equal to hamburger. So this is going to be our hamburger icon. And we want to use a button in this case because for accessibility reasons, we're going to have an on-click event handler on this. So when someone clicks on it, it's going to trigger the menu and it's going to open. Now, if someone doesn't have the ability to actually use a mouse, they would actually use tab, highlight that, and then hit enter, and that's going to trigger that on-click event. So that's why we're using a button here instead of a link tag. So once we have that ID down, let's go ahead and add the class. That's going to be a hamburger as well. And then we can go ahead and do onClick, and that's going to be equal to a function here that we have yet to write. And we're going to write this in our functions.js file. So once we have that, the next thing we want to do is beneath this, we're going to create a nav element. So let's do nav. And here we're going to create an ID. And in this ID, we're going to give this a name of main nav. We're also going to give this a class as well of main nav. And in between this nav, we're going to create some A tags. So what we can do here using Emmet is we can do A, then we can do times 4. And that's going to give us 4 A tags. And on this one, we're just going to give these all just blank links because we're not actually linking to anything on our page. And we're also going to give this an on-click event handler as well. And the reason we're passing this on-click in is when someone opens the menu and clicks on one of these items, we want the menu to go ahead and close. So that's why we're including them here on these A tags. And in between these A tags is where we're going to put our navigation words. So the first one's going to be home, about, creator, and then support. All right, so that's all the structure that we need for making our nav. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and add a main element component, which is where our main sections are going to be on our site. So let's go ahead and create a main element here. And another way you can create an element fast, as you know, is just to type it out. But if you want to add a class as well really fast, you can type a period and then the name of the class. So main, home, and then hit tab. And there you go. Now we have the main element tag with the class of home. And in here, we want to create a section, and we'll give this section a title called Home Info. We'll give in this a header, and this will have a class of Home Header. In between here, we want to create an H1 tag, and let's go ahead and give this a class as well of Home Title. And in between here, we'll go ahead and give that main title, which is YouTube creators. And here we're going to create a span element, which is going to be the spacer with that little thin line. And that's going to have a class of home spacer. Now, there's nothing in between this span. We're just going to style it. So we can go ahead and move on to the next element, which is a paragraph with the class of home subtext. And in here, we're just going to copy the lorem ipsum from our Figma file. So I'm just going to zoom in here, copy this, come back into our code, and then paste that in and save it. All right, so now that we have that, the last thing we want to do is we want to add an A tag or an anchor tag for the call to action. So let's go ahead and do that right now. And that's going to have a class of home CTA. And this is not going to link anywhere. And the words here is just going to be the ones that we're going to pull in from Figma, which is support a creator. All right. So now that we have some structure going on here, let's actually use an extension called Live Server in order to boot this up and then see these changes in real time. So what we want to do is you first want to come over to this icon here and search for Live Server. And now this is the one that you want. So you'll click here and you can click here on install. I already have mine installed, which is why I don't have that button. And once you have that installed, you might need to refresh your VS Code. But once you do that, you can right click on your HTML element and say open with Live Server. And that should open up Chrome, which it does. And I'm actually going to be using something different than Chrome in order to test out or have a development environment. And that's going to be the Mozilla Developers Edition. And the reason I like to use that over something like Chrome is that it has really nice like features for grid that I like to use, which you'll see once we get to the CSS portion of this. So let's just go ahead and copy this. I'm going to come over to Firefox Developer Edition, paste that in, and that server is live for us here. All right. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create our next section, and we're going to do that right beneath this closing section. So this is going to be section with a class of home cards. And in here, we're going to create two columns. We're going to call one of them group 1 and one of them group 2. So let's create a div and call this group 1. And in between here, we're going to first have our card, so our first card, which is going to be a square. So let's go ahead and give that call that a div. We'll go ahead and give this a home underscore card, as well as a home underscore card, and then it's going to be the square design. And in here, we're going to have a header, and we're going to have an H3 tag and an image. So let's go ahead and create that here. So let's go ahead and create a header. This is going to be an image. The source we're going to pull in from the images folder. And the first one we want is the Marquez Brownlee. Or actually, no, this is not going to be this one. It's going to be the profile image. So Marquez profile. Okay. And let's go ahead and just give this an alt. So we'll call this Marquez Brownlee. So we give a description of what this image is for. Make sure I spelled that right, which it looks like I did. And the next thing we want to do is we want to create an H3 tag, which is going to be his name. So H3. And in here, we're going to have an anchor tag. This anchor tag is not going to link anywhere, and it's going to have the name of Marquez. So just to make it fast, I'll just go ahead and copy this and then paste that here and then save it. And if we come back, we can see the profile image as well as his name. Now we're not seeing, it's not styled yet because we haven't added the CSS. So remember, HTML is just the content, and to make it actually look the way we want, we use CSS. So essentially, we're just going to do the same thing for the rest of the cards, but one of the cards I want to give a style called home card large, and the other one's just going to be a square, and the other one's going to be a large card as well. Now I'm just going to go ahead and speed through this so you guys can see the process without having to actually watch it in real time. So once I finish that, I'm going to head back to the HTML file and just go ahead and check that out, make sure everything looks correct and in order, which it does. So the next thing we want to do is just go ahead and import the JavaScript file right before the closing body tag. So the last thing we need to do here for the HTML is just go ahead and write a script tag where we say type is equal to text/JavaScript. And the source, which is where the file is going to be in the same file in functions.js. And go ahead and close that off. And that's everything for the HTML. Now we can actually bring this all together and make it look great by using CSS. So in the next part, we're going to be focusing on just that. So let's go ahead and head into our styles.css file. And the first thing we want to do at the top is I want to go ahead and import that font face that I included in the fonts folder earlier in the video. So to do that, we write @fontface. Then we give the name of the font family. We can call this anything we want, but I like to just call it what the font actually is, which is Yoxall, which I'm assuming I'm saying that right. And the source, we need to tell where it is. So that's going to be URL. It's in the fonts file, or excuse me, fonts folder, and it's going to be this one right here. All right, and just like any other font, in order to use this, we just say font family, and then we use the name that we gave it here, and then we can use it for any of the styling in our CSS. And the next thing we want to do is I want to target the root selector, and I'm going to create my CSS variables here, which are going to hold hex codes, which are the colors that we're going to be using in this project. So the reason I do this is, one, I can go ahead and just reference that variable really quickly. And if I wanted to change the color, instead of going through all the places I use that variable, I just change it in this one spot, and it's going to be reflected across my actual design. So in order to target the root, we just write the selector like this, and then we can go ahead and write our variables here. So it's 2 dashes, the name of your variable. So the first one's going to be dark1, and then the value, which is going to be this hex code. So I'm just going to copy it and paste that here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and do the next 2 variables as well. Save some time, I just want to paste those in. And another thing we're going to be doing in this video is using REM in order to set our font sizes. Now REM is a size that is going to be relative to the root font size. So by default it's 16 pixels, but I'm just going to go ahead and explicitly set it to 16 pixels. And in order to set a font size to 16 pixels in our design, we set it to 1 REM. And the reason this is great is because it allows people who need more accessibility features to increase the size of the text or the fonts in your design. And instead of explicitly setting it to 16 pixels, by setting it to 1 rem, and if that person increased that root element to something like 24 pixels, that 1 REM would now be 24 pixels. So it gives the user a little bit more flexibility and control in actually seeing the fonts, the size that they actually need to see it. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and say that font size up here, which is 16 pixels. If we ever want to change it, we can just come up here and change that value. All right, so the next thing we want to do is some CSS resets. So in order to target everything, we use the asterisks. We set margin to 0, padding to 0, and we set box sizing to border box. And in order to just overwrite these values, specifically margin and padding, we just do that in the styles below. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to style our HTML. And the only thing we need to add here is a height of 100%. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move this over to the left and move this over to the right so you can actually start seeing some of this stuff come together. And the next thing we want to do is style the body. So let's go ahead and target the body. And here we want to set a background color. And here we're going to set it to a variable. So in order to do that, we write var, open and close parentheses, and then the name of the variable. So in this case, light1. And then we can go ahead and set the height to this to 100% as well. And we're going to skip the hamburger design as well as the nav for now. And we're going to come back to that because it relates a little bit more to the JavaScript that we have to write. So let's go ahead and add the styles for home. And this is going to have a height of 100%. It's going to use grid. So in order to use grid, we have to write display grid. And then I'm going to break this design into two equal columns, or equal columns, I mean equal width of the available screen width. And the way we can do that is a really cool unit called fractions, or FR. And in order to create columns, you first write grid template columns, and we want two columns of equal size. So what we can do is 1FR and 1FR. So if we save that, you can see now that we have these two columns. And remember when I said Mozilla Developer has a really nice way of visualizing your grids? Well, if we come over and inspect the elements, and you can see here now on this home, we have this grid little toggle here. If we select that, you can now get a good visual of where your grid is. So we have the first 1FR and then the second, and we can also see the lines. So this is line 1, line 2, and line 3. Now, right now, we're not telling the content where it needs to sit in the grid, which is why it looks the way it does. So let's go ahead and just close this out. And the next thing we want to do is style the home info. And here we can actually define how much space it needs to take up. So what we're saying here is, hey, the grid column, we want it to start on line 1 and end on line 2, which is essentially what it's already doing. But we need to actually explicitly say that. Then we're going to use Flexbox for the content in this home info. In order to use Flexbox, just like with grid, we defined it in display. We want to go ahead and center the content. And we also want to align the items to the center as well. And let's go ahead and give this some padding of 16 pixels. All right, and the next thing we want to do is we want to style the home header. So let's come over and style that. And we're going to give this a max width. The max width is going to be 356 pixels. And go ahead and give this a margin as well. So now you can see our little header content area is now set with a max width, and we're going to give it some spacing, which is just going to space it out from the rest of the content. All right, so the next thing we want to do is style the title here. So we called that the home header, or excuse me, the home title. It's going to be a font family of the Yoxall, and we're going to give it a fallback of sans serif. So you can see that font has now changed. We can give that a font size of 4.125 rem, which is essentially 16 pixels times 4.125. So let's go ahead and save that. So you can see that resize. Give this a color and set the variable to dark. And the next thing we want to do is set the line height to 105%. Make sure we add the semicolon here. You can see how that just brings the fonts a little closer together. I think it looks a little nicer. And the next thing we want to do is just add a margin bottom. So it's going to do that of 56 pixels. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to style that line break, which we call the spacer. So let's go ahead and style that here. And what we want to do first is give this a display of inline block. Then we're going to give it a height of just 1 pixel, a width as well, and the width is going to be 102 pixels, and we'll give it a background color. So right now we're essentially just creating like a little div that is, or a span element essentially, that's just 1 pixel high and it's 102 pixels wide, and we just add a color to it. So that's going to be the var of dark. So now you can see that really thin line has shown up, and let's go ahead and give this some spacing as well of 48 pixels. All right, so now let's go ahead and move on to the subtext. And here's where we're going to use Open Sans. So we can say font family Open Sans. With a fallback of sans serif. Go ahead and give this a font weight as well. So font weight 400. Font size. And this is going to be a fraction of a rem, so it's going to be smaller than 16 pixels. So you can see how that font has changed. Let's go ahead and give it a color of the dark. And give it a line height of 165%, and a margin bottom as well of, let's do 48 pixels. All right, so now that we have that styled, the last thing we need to style here is the call to action section. So remember, this is an anchor tag, so we need to first give this a display of inline block, which is going to allow us to add padding and margin to the top and bottom. So first, let's do display inline block. Go ahead and save that. So let's go ahead and get rid of that underline by setting text decoration to, text decoration to none. So that gets rid of that default underline for links. Set a text transform to uppercase, which is going to force all the characters to be uppercase. And this is going to be Open Sans. Font weight here is going to be the bold, which is represented by 700. We're going to go ahead and give this a background color. And let's go ahead and make sure we color the font as well. That's going to be the light. All right, so right now you can see the edges are sharp. So in order to round the corners, we can use something called border radius. And we're going to set that to 50 pixels. Then we can set a border to 2 pixels, solid, and the color for that is going to be dark as well. And the reason we're going to do this is on the hover state, we're going to show this, and then we're going to change the background to the light. So then the border is going to show up. Now, right now, you can see that everything is really close to this. There's not spacing for the button. And the way that we're going to add spacing is using padding. So we'll write padding, give this padding of 16 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 48 on the sides. So you can now see that this looks appropriate. And one thing I forgot to do is set font size. It's a little too big. And again, that's going to be a fraction of a rem. So that's going to be 0.625 rem. All right, that looks more like the design. And we just have a couple more things here to add, and that's going to be for the transition. Now, you could like shorthand write transition like this, and then what you're targeting, the length, and then the type of timing that you want. But in this case, we're going to be targeting a couple different elements here. We're going to be targeting the background color and the color. So a real fast way of doing this, or the way that I prefer doing it when I have multiple items that I'm targeting, is first doing transition property, setting background color. So this is one of the elements, and then color. Then we can set transition duration to 0.3 seconds. And lastly, we can set the transition timing function to ease. All right, so now when we do the hover, these transition properties are going to have this duration and easing function. So with that said, let's go ahead and add those. So we'll go ahead and add a hover here using the hover pseudo class selector. And we're going to change the background color to light. And we're going to change the color to dark. So if we test that out and hover over this, you should see it. Oh, because I have this spelled wrong. You can see how it has a nice smooth transition into seeing that border that we created up here. The font changes to dark and the background changes to light. Perfect. And let's go ahead and just for good measure, go ahead and add a focus and active class to this. And this is going to allow people who need more accessibility for their website to be able to see what elements are focused or active. And we could just, add that to the hover class, but in order to really make it stand out, we're going to add an outline to it. So let's go ahead and do CTA focus, and it's going to be for home CTA active. And that's going to be the same up here. So let's go ahead and copy this. And the only thing we're going to change is outline, and we're going to set that to 5 pixels, solid, and we're going to set it to the red variable that we set above. So now if we hit tab, you can see how that element now has this really big red outline around it, which really signifies that this is the thing that you're about to click on, which is really great for accessibility. All right, so now that we finished this, this home content section, we can go ahead and move on to the card section. So the first thing we need to do is we need to target the card selector. And this is going to, first thing we're going to do is set grid column. And we want this to start on 2 and finish on 3. And in this, we're actually going to use another grid. So let's define that here. And this is going to have grid template columns. And we're going to break this into 2 equal columns as well. Just like we did for the big area, we're going to do it for this small one. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to say, hey, we want this card to be on the left. We want this one to be on the right. Or in this case, the groupings of the cards. So in order to create 2 equal sized sections, we can do the same thing. So 2 columns, each of them going to be 1 FR. So if we save that, you can see how these are now taking that space. All right, so now that we did that, the last thing we want to do is just add some padding to this. So let's do padding of 8 pixels. All right, so the next thing we want to do is style the group 1, which in this case is this left column. So in order to do that, we can say group 1. And what we want to do is tell it where we want this group to fit on the grid. So it's going to start on 1, and it's going to span 1. So we could have said start on 1 and finish on 2, but I'm just going to show you a different way of essentially writing the same thing using span. I like to use span because I feel like it's just a little easier to understand. So we're going to have that span 1 column, and this is actually going to use flexbox within this group 1. So I know it's kind of confusing how we're using this grid and flexbox kind of nested in each other, but this is a great way of using the two together. So this is going to be flex, so it's going to save that. So you can see it gets kind of wonky, but then we're going to set flex direction to column. So if we save that, you can see now essentially it looks the way it did, which is what we want. But we still have a long ways to go. So let's go ahead now and style the first image here of Marquez Brownlee. So the way we can target that is just saying group 1, and we need to target home card square, because this is the only square one in this grouping. And what we can do is give this a background image, and we can set a URL equal to the one that we imported. So that's going to be in images and Marquez Brownlee. So if we save that, we can see that behind this profile image, we have a picture of him. And it's hard to see, but we go ahead and add some other ones here. So background position is going to be centered. Background repeat, we have no repeat set. So we don't want this picture to repeat if there's size or room for it. And we want to set the background size of cover. All right, so now that I did that, we can't see it because of this profile image. So let's actually go ahead and style that profile image. And to do that, we need to go ahead and just style the home cards first. So I'm just going to do home card. Give this a margin of 8 pixels, a padding of 16 pixels. Display is flex. Align items is flex end. And it's going to set a background color for the cards as well, just as a fallback. So that's going to be dark 1. Okay. And now what we can do is go ahead and style the image here. So it's going to be home card. And we can go ahead and target the header image. And that's going to have a width of 50 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, and a border radius of 50%, which is going to give us that perfect circle. So border radius, 50%. So now you can see the background image, you can see the profile image, and right now this doesn't look right because we haven't actually told Flexbox how to size things, which we'll do in just a few minutes. But now we can actually see the background image. So with that said, let's go ahead and style the second card here in this group 1. So we'll do group 1, and this time we're going to do the home card, but instead of the square, we're going to target the one and only large card in the group 1 div. So I was just about to copy this and paste it down here, but realizing that isn't a good strategy because we'd be repeating ourselves. So what we could do here is just take this background position, cut it out, and then add it into this home card style. Because we come back to our index HTML, you can see that each card has that class. So all of them are going to have those properties passed down to them. So let's go ahead and copy and paste that here. And now all we need to do is set the background image for each of these cards. So this one is going to be, I think, Tech Me Out. So let's go ahead and save that. So now you can see that profile image. So those are all the styles for group 1. Now we can move on to group 2. So group 2, this is going to also set where the grid column is. So that's going to start on line 2. And just like the first one, it's going to span 1. So 1 column it's going to take up. This is also going to have display flex, and the flex direction is column. Okay, so we save that, and we can go ahead and essentially do the same thing that we did up here for these cards. So it's just going to copy this, come down here, and replace group 1 with group 2. And let's go ahead and change this one to The square one here is going to be Peter McKinnon. So let's do Peter McKinnon. And then this one's going to be iJustine. So let's go ahead and make sure we use the correct image. And I'm not seeing her photo come in. So let's come into our files here for our images and make sure. Okay, so I didn't name that one. So let's come in here and rename this to iJustine. Okay. And now we can go ahead and import that and make sure it comes in. Okay. So it's going to save that. Okay. Now we can see all the background images are correct. And the last thing we want to do is we want to add a gradient here. So if we come back into our actual design here, it's a little hard to see, but over this we have a slight little gradient. So on the image here, if we toggle this on and off, it has this nice gradient that makes the text easier to read because it's sitting on top of the image. So what we can do here in order to create that linear gradient is to come back here into this background image, add the linear gradient before the URL, and just put the URL in the same line. So how do you get the actual linear gradient code? Well, what I did is because I created it in Figma, I have that code already ready for me. So let's say, for instance, I create a rectangle here. I have that in that fill here. I have a linear gradient. So I added this to the rectangle. And if I come into code, you can see here, it gives me the linear gradient code for this gradient. So let's just go and copy that, get rid of that rectangle, come in here, and before the URL, let's go ahead and paste that in, and then make sure we add a comma, and then save that. Oops, and make sure we get rid of that right there. So I get rid of that semicolon added. And the right way is linear gradient, comma, and then the URL. And you can see now it added a really subtle gradient to this image. So let's go ahead and just copy this and add it to the other cards as well. All right, so now that we added the gradient, the next thing we want to do is just go ahead and style some of the elements in here. And we already styled the image, but we need to go ahead and style the H1 tag. So that's going to be in our home card, H3, and just go ahead and style the A tag. That's going to be the font family that we imported with a fallback of sans serif. We're going to set the font size here to 1 rem, color to light, and the last thing we want to do is get rid of that underline because it is an A tag. So text decoration, none. And I have a typo here, so let's make sure we get rid of that, fix it. Okay. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the square cards are actually square. And the way that we do this is first we set the height to 0, and then we can use a trick using padding top. And we set the padding top to a fraction. And what it does is it looks at the width of the element and sets that to a fraction of it. So let's say, for instance, we wanted a square. What we can do is set the padding top to 100%. And the way that that is calculated is by essentially like this. So it takes 100%. So 100%, and then it divides it by whatever aspect ratio you want. So for a square, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So 1 divided by 1 is 1, and 100% divided by 1 is 100%. But let's say, for instance, you wanted a 2-by-1 aspect ratio. So 2 divided by 1 is 2, and 100% divided by 2 is 50%. So that's how this is being calculated. But the way we write it is first adding it to the square here, the square style for the card. So home card, square. We set the height to 0. And here we go. We set the padding top to calc. And we actually need to calculate 100% minus the padding that we added to the top and bottom, which was 16 and 16. So that's 32. So what's 100% minus 32 pixels? Okay, so if we save that, you can now see that the square images are now square. Perfect. All right, so the next thing we need to do is tell Flexbox what to do with these images. And it's really simple. All we need to do is say home card and large. We set the flex to auto. So essentially this just says, hey, whatever space is available, go ahead and fill that up. So if we save that, you can see how these images are now filling up that 100% that we originally set. All right, so that's basically everything except for the menu up here, which is what I said we come back to earlier in the video. So let's actually scroll up to where we actually would write the code here, which would be right before the home selector. And the first thing we need to style is the hamburger. And the hamburger is just that little square icon with the 2 lines. So we called that hamburger. So we can just call it like this. We want to position this absolute. We want it to have a pointer when we hover over it. So it signifies that it's something we can click on. And I misspelled position. There we go. And we also want to use Flexbox here. And let's go ahead and give it a height and width so we can see it. So 50 pixels and a width of 50 pixels. And give it a background color of the dark. And we need to go ahead and get rid of that border, or change it at least. So let's do border. I'll keep it on 1 pixel. We'll do solid and then set it to transparent. So by default, buttons have borders, and essentially all we did there was just take it away. All right, and now that we have display flex here, you're really not going to see what it's doing because we're going to be using pseudo elements in order to create the lines. So before we move on, let's go ahead and create those pseudo elements right below here. So that's going to be hamburger. And the first one we're going to do is after. And we're just going to give this a blank content. So we're saying essentially it's like creating like a blank element. And we can give this a height of 20 pixels. A border left of 1 pixel, a solid value, and then a variable of the light. Oh, it's because I did a comma instead of a semicolon. Okay, and we can give this a transform as well. Rotate 90 degrees. Give it a margin, -3 pixels. And we want the transition to be on the transform because once we click on this, the element's going to rotate. So we just need to target it on the transform property. And that's going to be 0.3 seconds and ease. And we actually want to do the same thing for before as well. So let's go ahead and add that up here. So we're adding both of those as well. So that's going to be on before. All right, so now that we have those pseudo elements created, which are going to be those white lines, we can go ahead and come up to our hamburger and finish the styling for it. So we added display flex, but we haven't added any properties to display flex, or excuse me, Flexbox. So the first thing I'm going to do is flex direction. We're going to set the column. Then we're going to justify the content to center. All right. And then we want to align the items to center as well. All right. So now we can see those 2 lines appearing in our little button here. And the last thing we need to do is go ahead and position this where we want it. So that's going to be top. Because it is absolute positioning, we want to use top of 16 pixels. We want to do left. So we're going to move it away 16 pixels. And we actually want to give this a Z index. So the reason we're giving it a Z index is that we want it to make sure that it's on top of the menu. So the menu is going to slide out. If the menu slid out, it would cover up the icon, but because we're giving that a higher Z index, it's going to be above the menu. And we're going to give the menu a Z index of 5. So that's going to ensure that it covers up everything on the page once it slides over, but it's not going to cover up the menu because that has an even bigger Z index. So let's go ahead and give that a 10 and give this a transition. And the only thing that we're changing here is, I think, the border. So let's do border 0, 3 E's. Okay. So this must be a typo. I don't know why I have border here. So let's go ahead and get rid of transition. I might have just had a mistake in my notes. And let's go ahead and change this border to none. I'm not really sure why I was adding a style there in the first place. All right, so that's everything for the button. Now let's go ahead and add some focus and active selectors on this. So we already did the pseudo elements, but this is going to be pseudo selectors. So like we did for the button below, this is going to be for the hamburger. So hamburger focus, as well as hamburger active. What we're going to do is just add an outline here of that 5 pixels, solid, and set that to that red variable that we imported at the top. So if we come over and hit tab, we can now have that red outline on the button, making it very clear that the user is about to click on that. So the last thing we need to do for this hamburger icon is style the active class for it. And this is what we're going to be doing once we add that little toggle functionality, is we're going to be adding the active and then removing the active class depending on if that class is present in the element. So underneath this pseudo elements, let's go ahead and add the active class. So the first thing we want to do is we want to say hamburger. That's going to be active, and we're going to add a after pseudo class. And let's go ahead and just copy this content here because it's essentially going to be the same. And we actually don't need to copy all of it. We just need to copy the stuff that we're changing. So it's going to be this transform here. So let's copy this. And the active, we want to rotate it 135 degrees. So it's going to save that. And on the before, we want to essentially do something different, but instead of 135 degrees, we only want to rotate it 45 degrees. All right, so let's go ahead and make sure that this looks right by adding this style into our index.html. So we'll come up to our hamburger and just go ahead and add that into our class here. And the reason we weren't seeing that change is because I made a typo. So if we save that, you can see that that is now an arrow pointing back, which is what we just styled that as. All right, so let's go ahead and remove that because we don't want that there by default. We want it to be closed. So that's going to revert back to the 2-line design. All right, so then last thing we need to do is just style the main nav and then add the JavaScript. So in order to style the main nav, let's come back here and add the class. And this is going to have a position of absolute as well. And it's going to use flexbox within it. And we're going to do flex direction. Actually, let's go ahead and set the height. So let's do height of 100%. We'll set the width to 40%. Set the background color so we can see how big, actually see that space is taking up, and we'll just set that to the variable of dark. All right, so we can see that there, okay? And what we want to do now is just go ahead and add some flexbox properties. So we want the flex direction to be column. So now you're going to see the items stack on top of each other, and it's a little hard to see them, but we'll go ahead and change that in just a second. And let's go ahead and do align items to the center and justify content to the center as well. So there we go. Now it's right in the middle of this div. And the next thing we want to do is, by default, we want this to be over and hidden off to the left of the screen. So what we can do is use transform and then translate X, and then move it negative 100%. So we save that, it now disappears. And we also want to add a transition property for this so it gets a nice smooth animation. And that's just going to be on the transform because that's all we're going to change. And that's going to be 0.3 seconds with an ease. And like I mentioned earlier, we want this to cover the rest of the content, but we still want it, the menu or the hamburger to be on top. So we're going to give this a Z index of 5. All right. So now that we have the main nav done, we can go ahead and style what it's going to look like once it's active. So main nav, and then we'll give this a class name of active. And all we're going to do here is just transform it. So transform, and we're going to do translate X and just put it at 0. So let's go ahead and test this out. So I'm just going to copy this class here, come into the main nav and paste that in. There we go. So you can see how that is visible, which is what we're going to add with JavaScript. So let's go ahead and just get rid of that. And the next thing we want to do is we want to style the actual links in the navigation. So we can actually see it. Let's go ahead and just comment this section out. And we'll add the styles for the links or the anchor tags. So main nav A. And that's going to be the font family of Yoxel with a fallback of sans serif. These are going to be 3 rem, so 3 times 16. Let's go ahead and give these bad boys some padding and some margin. Go ahead and change the color as well. Get rid of that ugly underline, so texture decoration none. Let's go ahead and give it a border bottom, which we're going to be using for the hover state. So that's going to just be 1 pixel, solid, and right now it's just going to be set to transparent. And last, we want to animate that border, so we need to add a transition property. So we'll just target border bottom, 0.3 seconds, and then give that an ease. All right, so just a few more things here. The next one is going to be for the hover state. So let's do main nav A. So I'm just going to copy this a little faster. Have the hover selector, and that's going to be border bottom. Let's go ahead and just copy this and make sure this needs to be border bottom actually. So border bottom. Copy this, paste it. Instead of transparent, we want the white or the light color. All right, so let's go ahead and test that out. There we go. So we can see that design looks nice. And for accessibility reasons, let's go ahead and add an outline to this as well. So nav A focus and main nav A active. And here we're just going to do the outline as well of the 5 pixels. All right, so let's test that out. Hit tab, 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 tab. Cool. So all of those are easily, it's easy to tell which ones are about to be selected with that red outline. All right, so that's almost everything. We still need to go ahead and uncomment this out so the default state is hidden. And now we just need to add the JavaScript for when we click on this, that's going to change the button and then slide out the menu. And we also need to add some media queries here to handle how these elements look on different screen sizes. But let's go ahead and add the function here for the menu. And what we need to do is we need to go ahead and create that function by declaring it. and calling it the handle nav, which is what we passed in to the elements in our HTML. And here we're going to define some constants, which are just values. And this value is going to be set to document, get element by ID, and then the main nav. So what this is going to do is it's going to look at the document, the web page, and it's going to get the element by the ID. And what's the ID it's looking for? It's main nav. So if we come back into our index here, you can see this ID has a main nav. So the browser is going to know, hey, you're talking about this thing right here. And we're going to do the same thing for the hamburger. So let's go ahead now, instead of nav, we'll call this const hamburger. And go ahead and copy this, paste it in, and it's going to be looking for something called hamburger. And the reason that we write this is because we're going to be using this multiple times. So instead of writing it multiple times, let's save ourselves some space and just store it in a constant that's a lot smaller. Then we just write that constant instead of writing all of the code. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to write an if statement. And this if statement is going to check if the classes are there in the elements. And if they're not, they're going to either add or remove those class names. So what we want to do is we want to look at the nav class list and see if it contains the main nav active class. Now, I'm actually not going to see if it has it. I'm going to see if it doesn't have it. So the way we can negate this is by putting an exclamation point in the beginning. So this is saying the opposite of this value. Now, if that's true, if it does not contain it, what do we want to do? Well, we want to add it. So we can essentially do the same thing. So nav class, and instead of contains method, we'll use the add method. And that's going to add the main nav active class. And we also want to add a different class here on our hamburger. So let's do hamburger. And the class that we want to add here is hamburger active. And these are the classes that we created in the CSS earlier. Remember when I went back and forced those styles by adding them in the classes? These are the classes that we're adding here. And if this isn't possible, if this if statement fails, we need to do something else. So we'll write our else statement. And what we'll do is just copy this. And the method we want to use here is remove. All right, and that's all the logic we need to write for the handle nav function. So now if we click on this, crossing our fingers, the menu should animate, should be in our hamburger active state, and the menu should slide out. Then once we click on the hamburger icon again, the menu should slide back to the left, and the hamburger should look like the way it does now. So let's go ahead and click on this, and nothing's happening. All right, well, that's not a good sign. Let's come into the inspect element here, into our console, and it's saying handle is not defined. So let's come into the index here, and that's because the function I passed in here is not handle nav, it was just handle. So let's make sure we actually write that correct. Let's save that, click on it again. Boom, there we go. We can see the hamburger icon animates correctly to its active state, and the menu does as well. So once we click on this, it goes back, perfect. And let's make sure once we click on these link tags that the menu also moves to the left. So if we click, boom, perfect. All right, so that's basically everything. The only thing that's left now are the media queries. So what we want to do in here is add that to the bottom of our styles CSS file. So let's go ahead and move down to the bottom here and just add a couple media queries. And the first thing we want to add is we want to add one for when the screen size hits a max width of 1300 pixels and the max height of 800 pixels. So what this is going to do here is we're just going to change the way that mainly how much space this section takes up and then how much space these images take up. So the way that we can write media queries is first by saying @media, and then what we want to look at. So in this case, it's screens. So, tablets, computers, stuff like that, phones. So screen, and say what we want to target. So this is going to be max width of 1300 pixels. And we're also going to look at screens that have a max height of 800 pixels. And here we can add, the curly brackets and go ahead and write our CSS in between here. Now what we want to change is the main nav. And what we want to change here is we want to make it just go all the way across the page. So instead of that 40%, let's go ahead and just make it go all the way across. So 100%. Let's go ahead and just make this a little smaller. Click on this. And now you can see on smaller screens, the nav is just going to take up all that space. Perfect. Okay, and the next thing we want to do is the home info. So let's do home info. And here we want it to span those two columns. So instead of just taking one column up, that one that's to the left, it's just going to take both of those up, and the images are just going to be pushed down. So we do grid column. It's going to start on one, and it's going to span two columns. So now you can see how that's changed. Perfect. And the next thing is going to be for the home cards. So let's go ahead and make style that. And that's going to be the same. So let's just copy that style. And instead of repeating ourselves, let's make sure we just go ahead and make this correct by adding it like that. And then get rid of this up here. All right, and the last thing we want to do is we want to style the large cards. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to overwrite the style as what the square cards are, because I don't want them to be squished like that. So it's really easy to do. All we have to do is target the large card style, and just add the style that we did for the circle or for the squares. So it's going to be height, and then a padding top of calc 100% minus 32 pixels. Boom. So if we save that, you can now see that the images that were once large are now square. All right. And finally, this is the last thing we have to do, and that is changing on the really small screens. See how these get bunched up? What I want this to do is just have the whole grouping take up both of the columns that we created in the grid. So let's go ahead and do our last media query here. So at media screen, and this is going to target a max width of 600 pixels. And the only thing we want to change here are the styles for group 1 and the styles for group 2. And what we want to change is the grid column, and we want it to start on 1 and span 2. So take out the two columns that we created. So if we save that, you can now see that the images have some breathing room here on smaller screens. And as we go up, it goes back to the 2 column, and then goes back to the full width column here. We covered a ton in this video, so if you're stuck or have questions, jump in the comments and ask away. I try to answer as many as I can, and a lot of the times if I don't get to them, someone in the community will get to them and answer them. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And don't forget to check out our other design and development courses on skillthrive.com and on our YouTube channel. Again, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and I'll see you in the next video.